As most of you know, John's been under the weather this week, and I had talked to him a couple of weeks ago. I said I had a sermon idea in mind, and whenever he needed a break, that I'd be more than happy to fill in for him. And this started out, I was going to do it on June 3rd, which was the weekend of the state convention, and then I'm going to be out of town on Father's Day. And then Thursday night, I got a text that said, "Can you have that sermon ready by Sunday?" And I was like, So we're going to give this a whirl. I have entitled this sermon a word that most of us don't like. Well, maybe that's not the right word. I'm calling this sermon an offensive church. And I mean offensive in the sense of moving forward, not in the sense of being offensive to other people. Although maybe those two meanings might have a little bit of similarity. My passage this morning is going to come from Matthew chapter 16. I'm going to start reading in verse 13 and read through verse 20. This is a very familiar passage, but several years ago, I wish I could remember the man who preached the sermon or where I was, because it's been several years ago since this happened and I can't give him credit, but I heard a message on this particular passage that changed the way I thought about what it means to be a Christian. And there's a very small little phrase that I'm going to focus on that is what really impacted me so much, and it's really changed the way I think. Starting in verse 13 in Matthew chapter 16, I'm going to be reading from the English Standard Version. It says, "Now when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, 'Who do people say that the Son of Man is?' And they said, 'Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets.' And he said to them, 'But who do you say that I am?' Simon Peter replied, 'You are the Christ, the Son of the living God.' And Jesus answered him, 'Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven.' Then he strictly charged the disciples to tell no one that he was the Christ." Now, I want to focus a little bit on verse 18, because that's really the verse that changed this for me. I'd heard this passage read and taught and preached since I was a lot smaller than I am now. And it always focused on this idea of the confession that Peter made that Jesus is the Christ. And there is absolutely nothing wrong with learning that passage that way, because that is critical to understanding where Peter was at that moment and where the disciples were. Because they had not been told specifically what it was that Jesus was doing. He had taught them in parables and miracles, but he hadn't really come right out and said it. He'd been alluding to it, he'd been leading up to it, but never giving it to them. And then he asks them, "Who do people say that I am?" Some said he was John the Baptist, others said he was Elijah, Jeremiah, or one of the prophets. But then he said to them, "That's all good and fine, but who do you say that I am?" See, it really doesn't matter what everybody else thinks about Jesus. It matters what you think about who Jesus is. And he said, Simon spoke up, as Peter was wont to do on most occasions. He was the first one to get in. Imagine a kid in school who always has the right answer and always wants to be the first one. Peter was, I know. And he gave the right answer. And verse 18 is the crux of this. And Jesus says to him, "And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." Now, there are two key principles in this verse, and I'm only going to focus on one, but I need to talk about the other one. First of all, as most people know, Peter's name means rock. But Peter's name in the Greek language actually meant something closer to pebble or stone, something very small. But when Jesus says, "On this rock I will build my church," he's talking about a mountain-sized rock. And so, through the years, down through history, there have been people that built a belief that Peter was the rock that the church was built on, and when in fact, I believe it was the confession that he made that Jesus is the Christ is what the foundation of the church was built on. And on this rock I will build my church. And here's the key. This was the turning point for me. And the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. How many times have you heard that taught or preached? And we focus on Peter and the rock, building the church. But I want you to think about a gate for a minute. Whether you think about a gate that you see around somebody's house in modern times, or more appropriately, a castle gate, do you think of that as something that is an offensive weapon or a defensive weapon? It's a defensive weapon. It's something that is built to prevent people from getting in. Now, why in the world would Jesus use the phrase, "the gates of hell shall not prevail against it"? Because the church, my friends, needs to be an offensive church. It needs to be a church that is storming the gates of hell. It needs to be out there beating down the doors, bringing people out of where they are trapped, bringing them out into the light. You see, the devil already has the majority of the world. And he doesn't worry about them. And if you say, "Oh, well, I don't really believe that's true. It's probably more like only 10 or 15%. Well, no, that's not true. Because if 85% or 90% of people who claim to be Christians were actually Christians and were in churches, we wouldn't have empty chairs. We wouldn't have space along the walls. We wouldn't have space on the floor for everybody that would be cramming into this building if 90% of Americans were Christians, the way they claim to be. And so the gates of hell are packed with people that need to be brought out. And Jesus says that if we are the church built on that solid foundation of His name and who He is, that the gates of hell will not prevail against us. They can't stand. No matter how strongly they look, no matter how well fortified they are, it doesn't really matter. They cannot stand against a church that is on the offensive. So, as any good preacher would do, and as I was taught many years ago, I have 3 points to tell you how to be an offensive church. And then of course, as any good preacher would, I can't just do 3 points and go home. I've got to have points within my points. So settle in. We might be here a while. I did warn Braden, because this is such a passionate topic for me, I did warn him that if I get to go too long, to flash me a signal so that I know when it's time to shut up. So those of you that think you're in for a long haul, maybe. I don't know. I may ignore him too. You never know. First point is, to be an offensive church, you have to get ready. You have to get ready. John, a few weeks ago, preached a sermon on the armor of God, and I love that passage in Ephesians, and I want to look at it for just a minute. I don't want to go into it in too great a detail because he covered everything so well. But in Ephesians chapter 10, Paul warns us as Christians that we need to... Ephesians chapter 6 reminds me of a story. Everything reminds me of a story. There was a preacher that was preaching through the book of Luke, and at the end of the sermon, he said, "Okay, next week I want everybody to read Luke chapter 17." and be prepared to come back next week because that's what I'm going to preach on. And they came back the next Sunday, and he asked everybody, how many of you read Luke chapter 17? And everybody's hand went up in the air, and he said, now for the sermon on lying, because Luke only has 16 chapters. But anyway, Ephesians chapter 6, starting in verse 10, it tells us that we need to put on the whole armor of God. Verse 10 says, finally be strong in the Lord and in the strength of His might. Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. Now, if you notice, everything in the armor of God, except for one piece, is defensive, and John went into a lot of detail on that. We have one offensive weapon, and that's the word of truth. The word that Jesus gave us, that God gave us. That's our offensive weapon, and that's what we use to storm the gates. We don't put on that armor to protect ourselves from the daily attacks of the devil, although that's going to happen if we're a church that's on the offensive. We put that on to protect ourselves when we storm those gates. If you know anything about medieval history, you know that one thing that went along with the gate was a parapet with a bunch of notches cut into it, where archers would stand on top of the castle wall and shoot anything that came at it. Where Paul talks about the slings and arrows of the devil, the fiery arrows of the devil. He doesn't want to just let us storm the gates. He's going to try to stop us. And so, not only do you need to equip yourself with the armor of God, you also need to expect some opposition. You see, the devil doesn't care if a church isn't doing what it's supposed to do, because if a church isn't doing what Jesus told them they could do, then he has nothing to worry about. If all you're doing is coming here and sitting to somebody talk for 30 minutes and you walk out and you feel pretty good and you think, oh, okay, I'm going to make it through my week, okay, but you don't do anything to make those gates shiver just a little bit, the devil says, I'm not worried about him at all. But if you're out there sharing the gospel, if you're out there changing people's lives, you can expect that he's going to bring trouble your way. Nobody likes to hear that. I don't like to preach it. Nobody likes to hear it, but it's true nonetheless. The Bible doesn't tell us if you get persecuted or if you have trials. It says when you have trials. And a friend of mine a long time ago, we were talking about this subject, and he said, if you're not going through persecution, you're not doing something right. And I thought about that for a minute, and I said, explain yourself, what do you mean? And he said, well, if you're not advancing the gospel, the devil doesn't really care what you're doing or not doing. So if I'm not doing anything, he doesn't really care. The devil is in the protection business. Most people don't know that, but he's in the protection business. See, he's read the book. He got the last page. He knows what happens in the end. His job is not to try to change the ending that's already been decided. His job is to take as many people with him as he can when he goes. Do y'all realize that? He knows how this is all going to pan out. He knows that he is not more powerful than God. Do you believe that God is more powerful than the devil? Somebody? Anybody? Oh, I'm going to get myself all tied up here. I'm going to fall over. If he's more powerful than the devil and he's already decided the outcome, then the devil doesn't have any power over us. And the gates are really more like that little picket fence gate that everybody likes to have up around their house, which you could just kick in with a nice strong boot. So get yourself equipped and expect some opposition. The next thing that you need to do is get set. And I hope you are kind of getting the idea here. Maybe. The third one should be easy if you're following along. Get set. You need to set your vision to match the vision of the church. And if you're sitting here this morning and you don't know what the vision of this church is, then that's on us. That's on me, that's on Robbie, that's on Chad, that's on John. You should know what this church is all about. And our mission is to reach people so that they can discover and know who God is through His Son. That is what we are all about. And so we, as a church, need to get hold of that vision and take it and run with it. See, because we can't do it all. I've been in churches, believe it or not, I have been in churches where people thought that the sole effectiveness of the church rested on the guy who stood up on Sunday morning and preached the sermon, who also folded the bulletins and probably swept the bathrooms and took out the trash and made sure there wasn't food laying around in the fellowship hall after a Wednesday night meal. It doesn't all rest on one person. It doesn't all rest on 4 people or however many you have. It rests on every single person that's in this room. If you have the same vision, then that's what you need to set your mind on. Everything else is secondary. It doesn't matter what kind of music we play. It doesn't matter what kind of songs we sing. It doesn't matter what else we do during the week. If we are not committed to taking that vision out to the world, nothing else matters. Now, there's something to be said, and don't get me wrong, I think it's very important to disciple and grow the people that we have. I'm not saying that that's not the case. But at some point, we have to stop being in a Christian bubble, only surrounded by Christian people, only listening to Christian radio, only talking Christian things when there are people right next to us that are dying and going to hell. We have a neighbor. We have lived there 10 years, 12 years. Wow. 12 years. It's a long time. They are what I would call God-fearing people, in the sense that they know who God is and they believe that He exists. But they never went to church. They never were involved in anything. And within the last 6 months, year, 3 months, they have gotten involved in a church. They have gotten involved in a small group. And they are doing what we've done for 12 years. Now, I'm not going to stand up here and brag and say that we were responsible for that, because we weren't. God was. But I know my wife has prayed for both of them, and I know I have prayed for both of them to find that place where they can get that, because they didn't have it. There are people all around us who don't venture out on Sunday mornings. And I'm sure you know this because you all drove in here this morning and you didn't have to honk your horn at anybody. You didn't have to swear at anybody. You didn't have to be afraid that somebody was going to run you into the embankment under 55 because they were trying to cut you off. None of that stuff happened. Do you know why? Because nobody got out this morning. If they did, they got out 2 hours before you did because they wanted to be at the lake because it's so nice outside. See, if Sunday morning traffic were as bad as 5 o'clock traffic during the week, again, we wouldn't have enough chairs. We wouldn't have enough space for everybody. But that's just unfortunately not true. So it doesn't matter how many churches are in Hernando. It doesn't matter how many church people are in Hernando. The fact that the streets are empty and the churches are kind of empty means there are people in our community who are not getting the message for whatever reason. Okay. Matthew 28. If you don't know what our vision is, you should at least hold on to this one, because this is probably just as important, if not more important. In fact, it's what our vision is built on. Matthew chapter 28. If you want to know what the mission statement of our church is, just read these verses. Matthew 28, verse 16. Now the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. And when they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. And Jesus came and said to them, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you, and behold, I am with you always to the end of the age. Go, teach, baptize, rinse and repeat. Go, teach, baptize, rinse and repeat. You don't get to stop. You don't get to say, oh, I got one. We saved a family. We're done. Woo! Doesn't work that way. Until Jesus comes back. All right. Finally, you're going to get ready. You're going to get set. And then you're going to go. Thank you. You've been paying attention. It's just that simple. It really is. You wake up in the morning, you put on the armor, you expect to be affected or opposed. You set your mind on the vision that you have, and then you go and you do it. It's really just that simple. It seems like a sermon that I feel like I shouldn't even preach or have to preach. But I do. So, how do we storm the gates of hell and rescue people? Some of you will laugh at this reference. Some of you are unfortunately even too young to remember this, but back in the late 90s, there was a movie with Keanu Reeves called The Matrix. Some of you may know that movie. Some of you may not. Some of you are like, why is he talking about that movie? Well, when it came time to rescue Neo from the battery life that he was living in, he didn't know how bad things were until somebody presented him a better option. He didn't know he was a battery. He didn't know he was feeding the machine's power. All he knew that was life was okay, except he knew something was missing. He knew something was off. He knew there was something that he had to find. And I'm not going to sit. I'm going to stand. You all can sit. I'm going to stand here and tell you that every person that you come into contact with, whether they will admit it or not, is missing something. They are missing something in their life. They don't know what it is. And it's the one thing that is keeping them trapped behind those gates. You see, it's funny. The gates of hell do not open out so people can get out. I don't know if you ever know that or not. Most gates don't open both ways. Usually it's from the outside in. So you can't get out through the gate unless it comes down and lets you out. Most people don't know they're trapped until they're told they're trapped. Most people don't really know what it is that's missing until they're told what it is they're missing. But you have to know what it is they're missing. You have to be able to tell them what it is that they're missing. And that means you have to know what it is that He has done for you to fill that hole in your life. Because I'm going to guarantee you, every one of you that is sitting here at one point or another in your life felt that exact same way, like something was missing. Something was wrong. Something was off. You didn't know what it was until you found Jesus. And even then, if you don't find the right church and you don't find the right body of believers and you don't find the right friends, as Jim said, you still feel like something's missing. People need to know what they're missing, or otherwise they're not even going to notice. All right. In order to storm the gates, I believe the church needs three things, and I'm going to conclude my 3-point sermon with 3 more points so that you'll all know that I'm done. That's what a good preacher does, is he usually wraps up with 3 good points. The church needs 3 things in order to storm the gates. Number 1, it needs unity in purpose. It needs unity in purpose. It needs to be one in mind, one in vision, and it needs to be one with an idea that they need to go. If 100 people are gathered in the room and 95 of them say, yeah, let's do it, let's go, but 5 of them go, I don't know. Should we really? Maybe we should just stay here, make the inside pretty. Maybe we should worry about what color the carpet is or whether the preacher walks out down the right aisle. That's a story for another day because I'm almost out of time. I already got the signal. So, number 1, you need unity of purpose. Number 2, you need bodies willing to go. A church that is united under the idea of going but doesn't send anybody out fails to deliver. You can have 100 people in the room that are united in purpose. We need to go. And then when you ask those 100 people, okay, who's going out? Everybody goes, I don't know. What if people make fun of me? What if people yell at me? What if people throw stuff at me? You have to be united. You have to be willing to go. And number 3, you have to have confidence in the promise that the gates of hell cannot stand against a church that is doing what it's called to do. There is nothing this world can do that can stop a church that is doing what it's called to do. Not a thing. The fiery slings and arrows get put out by the shield. The blows struck at the head get protected by the helmet. All of those things are nothing compared to what the church is capable of doing. What is the worst thing this world can take from me but my life? Paul said, for me to live is Christ and to die is gain. How is that for bad? I just absolutely forgot what I was going to say. For me to live is Christ and to die is gain. And I can't help but think about our brother Herb when I think of that passage. Because I know Herb was a man who was confident in who his Savior was. He was a man who was confident that when this life was over, there was something more important. And he was a man that was willing to go. And so this church needs people who are willing to go. The gates are quivering, my friends. They're shaking in their boots, waiting for us to go. They haven't been taken care of. They're on spindly legs. There's splinters. There's holes. It's time to take back what belongs to God. Pray with me.